Paris, May 23, 1901. A letter lands on polished mahogany. No signature, no return address. Just ink forming words about a woman locked in an attic for 25 years. The envelope smells faintly of perfume. The handwriting is educated, careful. Inside those elegant loops lies an accusation that will crack open one of Paris's most respected families. Was this anonymous confession an act of courage or revenge? Quick truth. My history professor once told me nobody cares about the stories that didn't make the textbooks, that these forgotten voices would stay buried because people want their history safe and sanitized. I started this channel to prove him wrong, and thousands of you have done exactly that. But digging through archives and finding these lost stories takes real time. So if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, hit that like button and subscribe. And if you can, the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description helps me spend more time researching and less time worrying about bills. Shout out to Jorge, who just bought me a coffee. You're helping preserve history, one forgotten story at a time. Now back to this story. Secrets have weight, and this one had been pressing down on someone's conscience for longer than most people live. The Attorney General of Paris received correspondence daily, petitions from the poor, complaints from the wealthy, legal documents wrapped in red tape and formality. But the letter that arrived on May 23, 1901, carried something different. It carried the particular density of truth that had been compressed by years of silence. Monsieur le Procureur Général, I have the honor to inform you of an exceptionally serious occurrence. The words were formal, almost apologetic, the kind of phrasing used by someone educated, someone who understood how power spoke to power. But beneath that careful politeness lived something urgent, something that had perhaps waited too long to be spoken. I speak of a spinster who was locked up in Madame Monier's house, half-starved and living for years in filth. No signature, no return address, just those sentences, precise as surgical cuts, exposing what had festered in darkness at number 21, Rue de la Visitation. The Attorney General read the letter twice, then a third time. The Monnier name was not unknown to him. Louise Monnier was a widow of means and reputation, and a woman who hosted salons and contributed to charitable causes. Her son, Marcel, was a respectable lawyer. They were the kind of family that Paris held up as exemplars of bourgeois virtue. And now this, an anonymous accusation so specific it could not be easily dismissed, yet so extraordinary it strained belief. Letters like this arrived sometimes, vengeful servants, disappointed relatives, people with grudges disguised as civic duty. The powerful accumulated enemies the way old houses accumulated dust, and those enemies occasionally wrote letters. But something about this one refused to be categorized as mere malice. The handwriting was too steady, the details too concrete, and there was no demand for money, no threat, no attempt at leverage. Just information, delivered and left to sit like a stone in still water, waiting to see what ripples it might cause. The Attorney General called for the Chief of Police. Within hours, a decision was made. They would investigate. Quietly, at first. Discreetly. One did not simply storm the home of a respected widow based on anonymous accusations, but they would investigate nonetheless, because the letter's quiet certainty had planted a seed of doubt that refused to be ignored. The police prepared their approach carefully. They would knock. They would explain. They would ask permission to search the premises, relying on the family's cooperation and their own authority, if that cooperation proved insufficient. It was all very civilized, very proper. very French in its attention to decorum, even while preparing to uncover potential horror. They had no way of knowing that within hours, they would be tearing open shuttered windows with their bare hands, desperate to let light into a darkness that had consumed 25 years. They had no way of knowing that the smell alone would tell them everything before they saw anything at all. All they knew was that someone, somewhere, had finally spoken. And in speaking, had set in motion a revelation that would force Paris to look at itself and recognize what polite society could contain when no one asked the right questions. The letter sat on the Attorney General's desk, anonymous and insistent. Outside, Paris continued its daily rituals. Inside that envelope, the truth waited with the patience of something that had already endured far too long. Tomorrow, they would knock on the Monnier door. Tomorrow, silence would break. But tonight, the letter simply existed, and a small piece of paper holding the weight of a woman's stolen life. And in the attic at 21 Rue de la Visitation, Blanche Monnier lived another day in darkness, unaware that someone had finally remembered she existed. Polished brass door knockers have witnessed countless ordinary moments, but some announce arrivals that will shatter everything. May 24th, 1901. 3 police officers stood before the Monnier residence on Rue de la Visitation. Their uniforms pressed, their expressions carefully neutral. The townhouse before them spoke of old money and older traditions. Ivy climbed the facade in deliberate patterns. Windows gleamed. Even the cobblestones seemed cleaner here than in other parts of Paris. Officer Durand raised his hand to knock. Behind him, his colleagues shifted weight from foot to foot, uncomfortable with the task ahead. You did not simply raid the homes of the bourgeoisie without consequence. Careers ended over less. But the letter had been specific, and specificity carried its own authority. The door opened before knuckles met wood. A housemaid stood in the frame, her apron starched, her face composed in that particular expression servants cultivated when the powerful came calling. Behind her, the interior of the house glowed with the warm light of gas lamps and inherited wealth. "We need to speak with Madame Monnier," Durand said. His voice carried the weight of official business, but remained carefully polite. "It concerns a matter of some urgency." The maid disappeared. Minutes passed. Then Madame Louise Monnier herself appeared. A woman in her 70s whose bearing suggested she had never questioned her right to occupy space. Her dress was black silk. Her hair was arranged with precision. She looked at the officers the way one might look at unexpected rain, an inconvenience to be managed with grace. "Gentlemen, how may I assist the police?" Her tone was perfect. Curious but not concerned. Cooperative but not anxious. Durand had interviewed enough guilty people to recognize innocence when he saw it, and Madame Monnier wore it like a second skin. "We have received information," he began, choosing words carefully, "regarding a person who may be residing in your home, a woman. We are required to conduct a search of the premises." Something flickered across Madame Monnier's face. Not fear, not guilt. Something closer to irritation at a social disruption. "A search? Out of my home? On what grounds?" "On grounds we are not at liberty to discuss. We would prefer to conduct this matter with your cooperation, Madame." The word "prefer" carried implications. She heard them. After a moment of calculated silence, she stepped aside. "Very well, though I assure you this is entirely unnecessary." The house smelled of beeswax and lavender. Paintings hung in gilded frames. Furniture stood where it had likely stood for decades, solid and expensive. Nothing suggested disturbance. Nothing suggested secrets. They searched the ground floor, then the second. Parlors, bedrooms, a library lined with leather spines that had probably never been opened. Everything was in order. Everything was appropriate. Madame Monnier followed at a measured distance, and her presence a constant reminder that they were guests who had overstayed their welcome. It was Officer Laurent who noticed the attic door. Small, tucked behind a tapestry on the third-floor landing, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. The door itself was plain wood, unremarkable except for one detail. The lock was on the outside. "What is behind this door?" Laurent asked. "Storage," Madame Monnier said. Her voice remained level. "Old furniture, trunks, nothing of interest. We will need to see inside. I am not certain where the key is kept. Then we will open it without the key." The first blow of the shoulder against wood produced a crack. The second produced something else entirely. A smell. Not sudden, but rather unveiled, as if it had been waiting behind that door for years, compressed and concentrated and patient. But it hit them like a physical force. Officer Laurent stumbled backward, hand over his mouth. Durand turned away, eyes watering. The third officer, a young man on his first significant assignment, actually retched. It was not simply unpleasant. It was archaeological. Layers upon layers of decay, of human waste accumulated over time until it became something almost solid in its presence. The air itself seemed thick with it, as if years of neglect had given rot physical weight. Medical experts would later explain it scientifically. Ammonia from decomposing waste, bacteria colonies establishing ecosystems in enclosed spaces, the chemical signatures of long-term human habitation without sanitation. But in that moment, science offered no comfort. The smell was too immediate, too overwhelming for analysis. "Good God," Laurent managed, and his voice muffled behind his hand. "What is this?" They forced the door wider. The smell intensified. Durand pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, pressed it against his nose and mouth, and stepped forward. The others followed, their bodies rebelling against every instinct that screamed to retreat. The stairs beyond were narrow, dark. Each step climbed towards something that the officers' minds refused to fully imagine, even as their training demanded they continue. At the top, another door. This one locked as well. Behind them, Madame Monnier stood perfectly still. Her expression had not changed. Whatever was happening, she had decided to endure it with the same composure she brought to salon conversations and charitable functions. Durand did not ask for the key this time. He simply nodded to Laurent, and together they put their shoulders to the wood. One blow. 2. 3. The lock gave way with a crack that sounded too loud in the confined space. The door swung open, and the smell that had been terrible in the hallway became something else entirely in the room beyond. It was complete, total, an atmosphere unto itself. But it was the darkness that struck first. Even at midday, no light penetrated that space. The windows were shuttered, boarded, sealed against the world, as if the room itself was something shameful that needed to be hidden from the sun. "The windows!" Durand said, his voice rough. "Open them, now!" They moved toward the shutters, hands fumbling in the dark, desperate for air that did not carry the weight of years. Their fingers found latches, wood, nails. Someone had sealed these windows deliberately, thoroughly. Yet this was not neglect. This was intention. It took minutes to pry them open, minutes that felt like hours, while the smell surrounded them and their lungs protested every breath. But finally, blessedly, the shutters gave way. Light flooded in. Sunlight, clean and sudden and merciless. And in that light, they saw her, in the corner, on what had once been a mattress, but was now something else, something organic and rotted and unspeakable. A figure so thin, it seemed impossible that life could persist in such a frame. Blanche Monnier, alive, 25 years after she disappeared. The officers stood frozen, their minds struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with what human beings were supposed to endure. This was not a ghost. This was not a story. This was a woman, breathing, existing in conditions that defied every assumption about how families were supposed to function. Downstairs, Madame Monnier waited with perfect composure, as if nothing at all had changed. But everything had changed. The light had found what darkness had hidden, and there was no closing those shutters again. Human beings are not meant to exist in darkness, and when light finally arrives, it reveals exactly how much has been stolen. Officer Durand had served in the Paris police for 17 years. He had seen bodies pulled from the Seine. He had walked through tenement fires. He had documented violence in forms both sudden and slow. But nothing in his career had prepared him for what sunlight revealed in that attic room. Blanche Monnier was alive. That fact alone defied every assumption about what the human body could endure. Yet medical science recognized limits, thresholds beyond which survival became impossible. Yet here those limits stood refuted, breathing in shallow gasps on a mattress that had decomposed beneath her. She weighed 55 pounds. The medical examiner would document this later with the clinical precision required for legal proceedings. 55 pounds, distributed across a frame built to carry perhaps twice that. Her bones were visible beneath skin that had lost its elasticity, hanging loose in places where tissue had simply consumed itself for fuel. The mathematics of starvation are well understood. The body burns fat first, then muscle, then begins the slower process of breaking down its own organs. 25 years suggested she had been fed, minimally, just enough to sustain the basic chemistry of life. But nutrition and survival are different equations entirely. Her hair had grown long, matted into sections that had twisted around themselves over years without care. Some medical professionals would later speculate about the psychological effects of such extreme isolation. The human mind requires stimulation, engagement, connection. Remove these elements long enough, and cognition itself begins to deteriorate, not from disease, but from sheer absence of use. Laurent moved forward, slowly, the way one approaches an injured animal that might flee or fight. But Blanche did not flee, did not fight. She simply existed, her eyes tracking the movement with an expression that suggested she could no longer quite process what seeing meant. "Madame?" Laurent spoke softly. "Madame, can you hear me?" No response, or rather, and a response that existed somewhere outside language. A sound formed in her throat, something between recognition and confusion. But no words followed. The younger officer had retreated to the doorway, his face pale. "We need a doctor," he managed, "and an ambulance, immediately." Durand nodded, unable to look away from the woman in the corner. His mind kept trying to reconcile what he was seeing with the information he possessed. This was 1876 to 1901. 25 years, 9,000 days, give or take. Each one spent in this room, in this darkness, while life continued below and beyond and around her in ways she could no longer participate in. The room itself told stories in absence. No books, no papers, no evidence of occupation beyond the basic fact of a body existing in space. The walls were bare, And the floor was rotted through in places where moisture and waste had done their slow work of decay. A chamber pot sat in one corner, unused for what appeared to be years. She had simply stopped moving, stopped trying, stopped participating in even the most basic rituals of self-maintenance. Some would later claim the room was haunted, that servants refused to clean the third floor because they heard sounds, whispers, the scraping of something moving overhead. But sound travels strangely through old houses. Pipes expand and contract. Wood settles. The human mind, confronted with spaces it has been taught not to investigate, creates explanations for the unease it feels. Whether those servants heard Blanche or their own guilt hardly mattered now. What mattered was that she was here, alive, and required immediate intervention. Laurent removed his coat, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that sudden actions might cause harm. He approached Blanche slowly, speaking in low tones, explaining what he was doing, even though her expression suggested comprehension had fled long ago. "I am going to cover you," he said, draping the coat across her shoulders. The fabric seemed enormous against her frame. "We are taking you from here. You are safe now." Safe. The word felt almost cruel in its insufficiency. How do you assure safety to someone whose entire understanding of the world had been reduced to darkness and isolation? How do you explain rescue when rescue itself might be the most terrifying thing imaginable? Durand descended the stairs 2 at a time, his boot loud against wood. He found Madame Monnier exactly where they had left her, standing in the hallway with her hands folded, her expression unchanged. "You will need to come with us," Durand said. His voice carried no inflection, no judgment. Those would come later, in courtrooms and newspapers. For now, he simply stated fact. "You are under arrest for unlawful imprisonment." "I have committed no crime," Madame Monnier replied. Her tone remained composed. "That woman is my daughter. What occurs within my household is a family matter." "That woman," Durand said, and paused to let the words settle, "has been imprisoned for 25 years. This is not a family matter. This is a crime against humanity." Madame Monnier's expression finally shifted, not to fear or remorse, to something closer to indignation, the look of someone whose authority had been questioned in her own home. Upstairs, Laurent wrapped Blanche in blankets that officers had retrieved from other rooms. She made no sound, offered no resistance. Her body had forgotten resistance along with everything else. When they lifted her, she weighed almost nothing, a collection of bones held together by skin and the stubborn insistence of a heart that had refused to stop beating. The ambulance arrived within the hour. Medical personnel entered the house with stretchers and equipment, their professional composure faltering when they saw what waited in the attic. The lead physician, a man named Dr. Rousseau, examined Blanche with hands that trembled slightly, despite his years of experience. "She needs hospitalization," he said unnecessarily. "Immediate care. I am uncertain." He paused, searching for words. "I am uncertain what recovery might mean for someone in this condition." They carried her down the stairs, through the elegant hallways, past the paintings and the polished furniture and all the markers of civilized life. Madame Monnier watched from the parlor, flanked by officers, her face a mask of controlled displeasure. Outside, Paris continued its afternoon. Carriages passed. People walked. The sun shone with the particular brightness of late spring, and Blanche Monnier saw it all for the first time in 25 years, blinking against light that her eyes no longer knew how to process. The door to the ambulance closed, the horses pulled forward, and the house on Rue de la Visitation fell silent, its secret finally exposed, but its full story still waiting to be understood. Every prison begins long before the door is locked. Yet in the moment someone decides another person's life belongs to them. 1876. Paris in springtime carried a particular quality of light that photographers spent careers trying to capture. It filtered through new leaves, scattered across the Seine, painted the faces of young women who walked through gardens with parasols and possibilities. Blanche Monnier moved through that light, like someone born to it. At 25 years old, she embodied everything the bourgeoisie valued in their daughters: grace without affectation, beauty without vanity, the kind of presence that made her noticed at social gatherings without ever drawing the wrong kind of attention. She embroidered with skill that suggested genuine interest rather than mere obligation. She spoke 3 languages, yet she played piano well enough that guests actually wanted to listen. But these accomplishments were merely ornamental. What truly mattered in Blanche's world was less about what she could do and more about who she would become through marriage. Women of her class existed in a state of careful suspension between childhood and wifehood, their value measured in potential alliances and social advancement. Madame Louise Monnier had specific plans for her daughter's future, plans that involved suitable families, appropriate connections, and the continuation of status that the Monnier name represented. Marriage was not about love. It was about strategy, legacy, the careful weaving of family trees that would bear fruit for generations. Then Blanche met him. History has not preserved his name with certainty. Some records suggest he was called Henri Vigneault, though documentation from this period is incomplete. What is certain is that he was a lawyer, older than Blanche by perhaps 15 years, respected in his profession, but lacking the 2 things that mattered most in Madame Monnier's calculations: wealth and family connections. He was, in the language of the time, unsuitable. They met at a salon, one of those intellectual gatherings where Parisian society pretended that ideas mattered more than inheritance. He spoke about legal reform, about changes coming to French law, about justice as something more than tradition. Blanche listened in a way she had not listened to the young men her mother paraded before her, the ones with pedigrees and properties and utterly predictable futures. What began as conversation became correspondence. Letters exchanged through trusted friends, since direct communication between unmarried individuals was regulated by social convention. In those letters, carefully preserved until Blanche's imprisonment destroyed most of her personal effects, she wrote about books she was reading, thoughts she was having, questions about the world that existed beyond salon politeness. He wrote back with the kind of attention that suggested he saw her as something more than a decorative element in someone else's household. He treated her observations as worth considering, her questions as worth answering. This was perhaps the most seductive thing of all. Not romance, but recognition. Being seen as a person rather than a project. When Blanche told her mother about the relationship, she likely expected resistance. But what she received was something colder and more absolute. Not anger, but calculation. Madame Monnier did not shout. Women of her class rarely did. Instead, she explained reality with the patience of someone teaching basic arithmetic. The lawyer was too old, too poor, too common in his origins. Marriage to him would mean social diminishment, financial struggle, the loss of everything the Monnier name represented. "You will end this," Madame Monnier said, not as a request, as a statement of fact. Blanche refused. The refusal itself was remarkable. Women in 1876 had limited power to direct their own lives, particularly women of Blanche's class, whose entire existence was structured around obedience first to fathers, then to husbands. Saying no to a mother was not simply defiance, and it was a rejection of the entire social contract that governed how young women were supposed to move through the world. Madame Monnier tried different approaches. Reason. Guilt. The suggestion that Blanche was being selfish, thinking only of her own desires rather than family duty. When these failed, she moved to threats. Disinheritance. Social exile. The destruction of reputation that would make Blanche unmarriageable to anyone, suitable or otherwise. Blanche continued to refuse. Historical accounts suggest the relationship progressed. The lawyer formally requested permission to court Blanche, following the proper protocols, even as he must have known the answer would be no. Madame Monnier denied the request with the kind of finality that left no room for negotiation. But young people in love have always found ways around parental disapproval. Secret meetings, chaperoned visits that became less supervised than they should have been. The planning of a future that existed in defiance of maternal authority. Madame Monnier watched all of this with the patience of someone playing a longer game. She attended social functions. She smiled at neighbors. She maintained the appearance of a household in perfect order, even as she was calculating exactly how to reassert control over a daughter who had forgotten her place. Some historians have suggested that the lawyer eventually gave up, that he recognized the impossibility of the situation and withdrew. Others believe he persisted, that the relationship continued in secret, even as Madame Monnier tightened her grip. What is certain is that in late 1876, Blanche Monnier stopped appearing in public. The transition was gradual at first, a missed salon here, a declined invitation there, the kind of social withdrawal that could be explained by illness or family obligation, or any number of acceptable reasons. Then the explanations became more elaborate. She had gone to a private school. She was traveling for her health. She was visiting relatives in the countryside. Each story lasted until people stopped asking, which in polite society happened sooner than one might expect. And somewhere in those months, between the last time and anyone outside the family saw Blanche walking in gardens and the moment she vanished entirely from Paris society, a door was locked. A decision was made. A mother looked at her defiant daughter and chose imprisonment over disobedience. The woman who embroidered, who spoke 3 languages, who played piano, and dreamed of a future that included love rather than mere alliance, was led upstairs she would not descend for 25 years. And Madame Monnier resumed her social calendar, confident that she had solved a problem, the only way someone with absolute power over another human being could solve it: by making that human being disappear. Disappearances do not require wilderness or distance when they happen inside houses where no one thinks to look. The neighbors on Rue de la Visitation noticed, at first. Madame Beaufort, who lived 3 doors down, mentioned to her husband that she had not seen young Blanche Monnier at Mass for several weeks. Monsieur Gautier, whose property adjoined the Monnier garden, remarked that the piano music that used to drift through open windows had gone silent. The shopkeeper who sold ribbon and thread noted that Blanche no longer came to browse, though her mother continued to make purchases. These observations floated through conversation the way minor curiosities do in neighborhoods where people have known each other for years. Noted, but not investigated. Mentioned, but not pursued. When asked, Madame Monnier had explanations ready. Blanche had taken ill. Nothing serious, but enough to require rest and limited social engagement. Then the story shifted. Blanche had gone to stay with relatives in the countryside, somewhere near Lyon, for the fresh air and change of scenery. Later still, when that explanation had served its purpose, the Madame Monnier let it be understood that her daughter had entered a private institution, the kind wealthy families used when mental delicacy required professional care. Each story was vague enough to discourage further questions, while specific enough to sound plausible. And crucially, each story played on assumptions about women's fragility, about the privacy owed to families dealing with medical or psychological matters, about the impropriety of prying into another household's difficulties. The bourgeoisie of Paris understood boundaries. One did not ask uncomfortable questions. One did not push past polite deflections. One certainly did not suggest that a respected widow might be lying about her daughter's whereabouts. So they stopped asking. Madame Beaufort accepted the explanation and redirected her attention to other neighborhood matters. Monsieur Gautier focused on his own family. The shopkeeper assumed Blanche had married or moved away and forgot to wonder why no announcement had been made. This is how disappearances succeed. Not through elaborate cover-ups, but through social convention that values comfort over curiosity. Meanwhile, life at the Monnier residence continued with remarkable normalcy. Madame Monnier hosted salons where intellectuals discussed philosophy and politics. She attended charity functions and accepted recognition for her philanthropic work. She appeared at the opera, at gallery openings, at all the places where Paris society gathered to see and be seen. Her son Marcel, who had completed his legal training, established his own practice. He lived in the family home, conducting business from a ground-floor office where clients came and went without ever suspecting what existed 2 floors above their heads. He married in 1884, a respectable union that produced no children but seemed conventional in every other regard. The household employed servants, a cook, a housemaid, a man who maintained the garden and handled heavy work. These staff members came and went through their daily routines, cleaning rooms and preparing meals and managing the practical details of bourgeois life. None of them were permitted on the 3rd floor. This restriction was explained as a matter of privacy. The 3rd floor contained family quarters, personal spaces not appropriate for servant access. In wealthy households, such boundaries were unremarkable. But the help had their domains and the family had theirs, and these territories rarely overlapped. But servants talk. In kitchens and market squares, in moments stolen between tasks, they share observations that polite society never hears. And the Monnier servants noticed things. Strange sounds from above. Scraping, perhaps, or the creak of floorboards under weight that should not have been there. One housemaid claimed she heard crying late at night, though others dismissed this as imagination or the wind moving through old chimneys. Another reported odd smells drifting down the stairs, though in a city where sanitation was imperfect and buildings old, unusual odors were hardly proof of anything specific. Some servants left the Monnier household after brief employment, citing vague discomfort they could not quite articulate. The others stayed for years, either unbothered by whatever they sensed or willing to ignore it for steady wages. Whether supernatural sensitivity or simple observation, these servants existed on the edge of knowing. They felt wrongness without being able to name it. They suspected secrets without having evidence to support suspicion. And like the neighbors, they ultimately chose not to pursue the questions that their instincts raised. Because pursuing those questions meant confronting authority. It meant accusing employers. It meant risking employment in a city where positions were scarce and references essential. The cost of knowing was too high, so they chose comfortable uncertainty instead. Years passed this way. 1877 became 1880. 1880 became 1890. each year identical to the last in its careful maintenance of normalcy. Madame Monnier aged gracefully, her reputation growing as her contributions to charity increased. Marcel established himself in legal circles, respected if not particularly distinguished. And upstairs, Blanche existed in darkness that had become her entire world. The woman who once walked in garden and played piano and dreamed of futures that included choice. The woman who had said no and paid for that refusal with everything. The Monnier family attended funerals for neighbors who remembered Blanche from before. They hosted the children of those neighbors, young people who had no memory of a woman named Blanche Monnier, because she had been erased before they were old enough to form lasting impressions. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the vanishing. Not that it happened, but that it succeeded so completely. A woman disappeared from one of Paris's fashionable neighborhoods, and society simply accepted her absence, filled in the space she left with assumptions, and moved forward without her. 25 years of parallel existence, the Monniers living their public lives downstairs, while Blanche endured her private death upstairs. 25 years of dinner parties and legal consultations and charitable donations conducted in rooms directly below a locked attic, where a woman slowly starved for the crime of choosing her own heart over her mother's plans. The house kept it secret because everyone who might have exposed it decided that not knowing was easier than knowing. That comfort was more valuable than truth, and that the privacy of the powerful mattered more than the freedom of the powerless, until someone decided it did not, until someone put pen to paper and wrote the letter that would finally, after 9,000 days of silence, make the invisible visible again. The vanishing had been complete, but vanishings, even perfect ones, can be undone by a single act of conscience that refuses to look away. Monsters rarely look like monsters when they are accepting plaques for humanitarian service. Madame Louise Monnier received her first civic commendation in 1883, 7 years after locking her daughter in the attic. The award recognized her contributions to a charity supporting impoverished widows, women whose circumstances had left them vulnerable and dependent on the kindness of those more fortunate. Yet she accepted the honor at a ceremony attended by Paris's social elite. The room glowed with gaslight and good intentions. Speeches praised her generosity, her tireless work on behalf of those who could not help themselves. She stood before the assembled crowd in black silk, her bearing dignified, her smile modest but pleased. Directly above her house, 3 miles away, Blanche sat in darkness that had become so familiar it was no longer frightening, just constant. Just everything. The human mind possesses a remarkable capacity for compartmentalization. Psychologists would later study this phenomenon in detail, documenting how individuals can hold contradictory realities simultaneously without experiencing cognitive dissonance. A person can genuinely believe themselves good while committing acts of profound cruelty, because the mind constructs walls between these different versions of self. Madame Monnier built those walls with the precision of an architect. In one compartment lived the philanthropist, the woman who donated money to orphanages and hospitals, who organized fundraising events for the poor, who spoke eloquently about Christian duty and the responsibility of the wealthy to lift up the less fortunate. This version of Louise Monnier was sincere in her belief that she was a force for good in the world. In another compartment lived the mother, the woman who climbed stairs twice daily carrying minimal food to a daughter she had decided was better off confined than free to make inappropriate choices. This version of Louise Monnier was equally sincere in her belief that imprisonment was correction, that isolation was protection, so that absolute control was a form of love. The walls between these compartments never wavered. They could not, because acknowledging the contradiction would have shattered the entire structure of her self-understanding. Her charitable work intensified over the years. In 1889, she funded a program providing medical care to destitute women. In 1894, she sponsored an initiative teaching impoverished girls domestic skills that might make them employable. The causes she supported all shared a common theme: helping vulnerable women and children, people who lacked power and needed intervention from those with means. The irony was apparently invisible to her. Photographs from this period show a woman who aged gracefully into authority. Her posture remained straight, yet her expression carried the particular confidence of someone who had never seriously questioned their right to make decisions for others. She looked, in every measurable way, exactly like what she claimed to be, a pillar of respectable society. People who knew her described her as devout. She attended Mass regularly, contributed to church maintenance, participated in religious study groups. Her faith was not performative, but genuine, rooted in a worldview where hierarchy was divine order and obedience was virtue. In this framework, her daughter's imprisonment was not cruelty, but necessary correction of defiance against both maternal and moral authority. Some psychological theories suggest that her charitable work served as unconscious compensation, that by helping strangers, that she could avoid confronting what she was doing to her own daughter. But this interpretation assumes awareness, and all evidence suggests Madame Monnier lacked awareness entirely. She was not compensating. She was simply being two completely different people in two completely separate domains of her life. Her social calendar remained full. Dinner parties, salon gatherings, charitable events where she circulated among Paris's elite, discussing art and politics and the improvement of society. She had opinions on education reform, on poverty reduction, on the moral obligations of the wealthy class. And then she would return home, climb the stairs past the locked door, and continue the daily routine of maintaining her daughter's imprisonment without apparent internal conflict. Marcel, her son, watched all of this, participated in it, at the charitable events and the family secret coexisting in the same household, maintained by the same hands. What conversations, if any, occurred between mother and son about the woman locked upstairs has been lost to history. But Marcel's continued presence in the house suggests either agreement or the same capacity for compartmentalization that his mother had perfected. In 1898, 3 years before Blanche's discovery, Madame Monnier received recognition from a Catholic charity organization for her decades of service to the poor. The ceremony was held in a cathedral. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, painting the congregation in colors that seemed to promise redemption. The priest who presented the award spoke about moral courage, about the difficulty of sustained compassion in a world that often rewarded selfishness, about how Madame Monnier embodied the Christian virtues of charity and selflessness. She accepted with humility that seemed genuine because it was genuine. She believed, truly believed, that she deserved recognition for her good works. The cognitive dissonance that should have destroyed her simply did not exist. The walls held firm. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. Not that cruelty existed, but that it coexisted so seamlessly with virtue. That someone could be simultaneously genuinely charitable and genuinely monstrous without ever recognizing the contradiction. Evil often imagines itself as good. Abusers often believe themselves to be acting from love. And people who imprison their own children often convince themselves that confinement is protection, that control is care, that the suffering they inflict is somehow for the victim's own benefit. Madame Monnier stood as proof that morality and monstrosity are not opposites, but can occupy the same person, the same heart, the same hands that accept awards and turn locks. When police arrested her in May of 1901, she expressed not guilt, but outrage. Not shame, but indignation. She had committed no crime. She had simply exercised authority over her own household, over her own daughter, in ways she believed entirely appropriate. The awards remained in her parlor, polished and displayed. Evidence of virtue that shared space with evidence of horror. Both equally real, both equally true. Yet, and that truth is more unsettling than any ghost story, more disturbing than any supernatural claim. Because ghosts we can dismiss. But this capacity for humans to be simultaneously good and evil, generous and cruel, honored and horrifying, that walks among us still. Silence is not neutral when someone is screaming in the room above you, even if those screams eventually stop. Marcel Monnier slept in a bedroom on the second floor of the house on Rue de la Visitation. Directly above him, separated by perhaps 12 feet of wood and plaster, his sister existed in conditions that would eventually shock a nation. Between them, nothing but old timber and the choice he made every single day to do absolutely nothing. Architecture has a way of revealing what people prefer to keep hidden. Old houses were not built for privacy, but sound travels through floorboards, up chimneys, along the bones of the structure itself. In a house from the 1800s, you could hear footsteps from 2 floors away. Voices carried through walls. The simple act of moving a chair across a room would announce itself throughout the building. Marcel Monnier lived in that house for 25 years, while his sister was imprisoned upstairs. The claim that he did not know strains credibility past the breaking point. He was not a child during Blanche's captivity. He was a grown man, educated, trained in law, capable of complex reasoning about justice and rights and moral obligation. He built a legal practice based on his ability to argue cases, to recognize wrongdoing, to apply principles of right and wrong to the situations his clients brought before him. And every night meant he climbed the stairs past the locked door and went to sleep. His routine was methodical. Morning coffee in the dining room while reviewing case files. A walk to his ground floor office where clients discussed contracts, property disputes, the small legal conflicts that comprised a modest practice. Lunch prepared by the cook. Afternoons spent drafting documents or meeting with other lawyers. Evening meals with his mother, discussing news and neighborhood matters. A life of complete normalcy, built on a foundation of accepted horror. Some have suggested he simply did not think about it, that humans possess a remarkable capacity for selective attention, for training the mind to skip over uncomfortable realities in favor of comfortable routine. Psychologists call this willful blindness, and the active choice to not see what exists plainly in front of you, because seeing would require action, and action would disrupt the life you have arranged for yourself. But willful blindness requires effort. It requires the constant maintenance of internal walls between what you know and what you allow yourself to acknowledge. For 25 years, Marcel maintained those walls with the discipline of someone who understood exactly what would collapse if they ever came down. There were sounds. There had to be. In the early years, Blanche would have moved around the room, would have called out, perhaps, would have made the noise that humans make when they still believe someone might listen. Old buildings amplify sound in strange ways. A footstep becomes a knock. A voice becomes something that might be wind or might be plea. But whether Marcel heard these sounds or trained himself not to hear them amounts to the same crime. His mother managed the daily reality of Blanche's imprisonment. She climbed the stairs with minimal food. She maintained the lock. She created the explanations that neighbors would accept. But Marcel's role was equally essential, though more passive. He provided the second presence in the household, the witness whose silence validated the mother's choices. In families where abuse occurs, there are often two types of participants: the active perpetrator who commits the harm, and the passive enabler who knows and does nothing. Both are necessary for sustained cruelty. The perpetrator provides the action. The enabler provides the permission through their refusal to intervene. Marcel was the perfect enabler. A lawyer who understood concepts like false imprisonment and human rights in abstract professional contexts, but somehow could not apply them to his own household. A man who argued for justice in courtrooms while justice rotted in the attic above his bedroom. He married in 1884. His wife moved into the house, became part of the household, lived beneath the locked door just as Marcel did. Whether she knew, whether she asked questions, whether Marcel told her or maintained the family fiction, history has not recorded. But she too participated in the daily routine of normalcy that required everyone to simply not acknowledge the woman slowly dying upstairs. The marriage produced no children. Some would later speculate about supernatural intervention, about curses on households where such secrets are kept. But biology needs no supernatural explanation. Stress, guilt, the unconscious weight of knowledge, these affect human bodies in measurable ways. Or perhaps they simply chose not to have children, or could not for purely medical reasons. What matters is that the house remained organized around the secret. Every person in it knew or suspected or chose not to know, and all of them continued their daily lives as if everything was normal. This is the particular horror of Marcel's role. Not violence, but acceptance. Not action, but the absence of action sustained across 9,000 days. Each morning he woke up with the power to end his sister's suffering. Each night he went to sleep having chosen not to use that power. Legal systems struggle with this kind of guilt. Laws are designed to punish action, as to hold people accountable for what they do. But what about what they do not do? What about the crime of watching and remaining silent, of knowing and choosing comfort over intervention? French law in 1901 had no answer to these questions. There was no statute requiring Marcel to rescue his sister. No law demanding that witnesses to ongoing cruelty must act. The legal framework assumed that moral obligation would fill the gaps that legislation left open. It assumed wrong. Marcel represented something perhaps more disturbing than his mother's act of cruelty. He represented the ordinary person who knows evil is occurring and decides that their own peace matters more than someone else's suffering. The bystander who tells themselves it is not their responsibility, when the witness who convinces themselves that speaking up would not help anyway. His mother was a monster, but Marcel was something more common and therefore more frightening. He was the person who could have been a hero and chose to be nothing at all. Every system of oppression requires people like Marcel, people who see and do not act, who know and remain silent, who understand that wrong is occurring, but decide that maintaining their own comfort is worth someone else's continued torment. 25 years of that choice, 25 years of waking up, hearing or not hearing the sounds from above, and deciding that today, like yesterday, like every day before, he would do nothing. When police finally opened that door, Marcel's crime was complete. And not in the moment of opening, but in all the moments before, when the door remained locked, and he remained silent. Complicity is not passive. It is active permission given through inaction. And Marcel Monnier gave that permission every single day for a quarter of a century. News travels through cities like fire through dry timber, and some stories burn hot enough to consume everything they touch. By May 25, 1901, every newspaper in Paris carried the story, not buried in back pages alongside minor crime reports, but emblazoned across front pages in typeface reserved for matters of national significance. The Monnier case had exploded from a police investigation into a scandal that would grip the entire nation. Le Figaro called it a crime against humanity perpetrated in our own streets. Le Petit Journal ran sketches of the attic room based on police descriptions, illustrations that captured the horror while remaining suitable for family readership. La Presse devoted 3 full columns to the case, documenting every detail that authorities had made public. The French people read these accounts over breakfast coffee and evening wine, and they were horrified. This was not some distant tragedy in an unfamiliar place. This was Paris. Rue de la Visitation was a respectable neighborhood where their friends and colleagues lived. The Monnier family attended the same churches, shopped in the same markets, moved through the same social circles. If this could happen there, but if a woman could be imprisoned for 25 years in a house where neighbors walked past daily, then what other horrors might be hiding behind civilized facades? Crowds began gathering outside number 21. At first, just curious onlookers, people who wanted to see the house where such things had occurred. But curiosity quickly transformed into something uglier: anger, disgust, the particular fury that comes when people realize they were complicit through ignorance, that they walked past suffering and never thought to question the silence. Someone threw a stone. It shattered a ground floor window. Police had to establish a presence to prevent the crowd from turning into a mob. Parisians who prided themselves on civilization were discovering that civilization was a thinner layer than they had believed, and beneath it lived the same capacity for violence that they condemned in others. The details emerging from the investigation only intensified the outrage. Newspapers reported Blanche's weight, her condition, the state of the room where she had been kept. They interviewed the officers who had discovered her, men who spoke carefully about horrors they were still processing. They sought out neighbors who suddenly remembered small oddities they had dismissed at the time, reframing old observations through new understanding. The story resonated particularly with women. In cafes and parlors across Paris, women discussed how easily Blanche could have been them, how many mothers controlled daughters through manipulation and social pressure, how many families prioritized reputation over individual happiness. The Monnier case represented an extreme version of dynamics that existed in less obvious forms throughout bourgeois society. Editorial writers seized the case as evidence for their various causes. Some argued it demonstrated the need for legal reforms, protecting individual rights within families. Others claimed it revealed the moral bankruptcy of the wealthy classes. Still others used it to advocate for better oversight of households, for laws requiring regular welfare checks, for systems that could prevent such tragedies. But beneath all the outrage and analysis lived a more uncomfortable truth. This had been preventable. At any point during 25 years, intervention could have occurred. Neighbors could have questioned more persistently. Servants could have reported their suspicions. If the lawyer Blanche had loved could have pushed harder. Anyone with awareness or even vague unease could have acted. And no one did. The public fury directed at Madame Monnier was intense, But it was also convenient. By making her into a singular monster, Parisians could avoid examining their own complicity. They could tell themselves that they would have acted differently, that they would have seen the signs, that they were fundamentally different from the people who had lived beside the Monnier house and noticed nothing. Street vendors sold pamphlets detailing the case, embellishing where facts were insufficient. Theater companies rushed to produce melodramas based on the story, giving audiences catharsis through fictional rescue that arrived in time. Artists created paintings depicting Blanche's discovery, yet romanticizing horror in ways that made it consumable as entertainment. The case became a sensation, which meant it also became a commodity. People who genuinely cared about Blanche's suffering shared attention with people who simply enjoyed the scandal. Authentic outrage mixed with performative indignation. It became fashionable to express horror at the Monnier family, to signal one's own moral superiority by condemning them loudly and publicly. Within this storm of reaction, Blanche herself remained largely invisible. She was in hospital, incapable of speech, her mind damaged beyond what immediate treatment could repair. The woman at the center of the scandal that consumed Paris could not participate in conversations about her own suffering. She had become symbolic rather than human, a representation of victimhood, a cautionary tale, as a political argument. Everyone spoke about her, but few seemed to consider her as a person who would have to continue existing after the outrage faded. Because outrage does fade. Newspapers find new scandals. Public attention shifts to fresh horrors. The intensity of emotion that feels permanent in the moment proves remarkably temporary when sustained attention requires actual effort rather than merely vocal condemnation. The crowds outside the Monnier house thinned as days passed. The evening conversations in cafes moved to other topics. The editorial writers found new injustices to analyze. Paris, having expressed its collective disgust, began the process of moving forward. But forward to what? The outrage had erupted, had burned bright and hot and righteous. Yet outrage alone accomplishes nothing if it does not transform into action, into change, into systems that prevent future horrors. The real question was whether French society would use this case to examine the structures that had enabled it. Would they reform laws about family privacy? Would they create protections for individuals trapped in abusive households? Would they build systems for intervention before tragedies became complete? Or would they simply condemn one family as monsters, congratulate themselves for their moral clarity, and continue unchanged in ways that would allow the next Blanche Monnier to suffer in silence? The answer would come in the courtroom, where legal systems would have to confront not just what the Monniers had done, but what French law permitted through its silences and absences. Justice, that word everyone used so freely in their outrage, it was about to reveal itself as far more complicated than righteous fury suggested. Courtrooms promise accountability, but sometimes the law reveals itself as a catalog of what it cannot touch rather than what it can punish. Madame Louise Monnier did not live to see trial. 15 days after her arrest, her heart simply stopped. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, though physicians noted she had shown no prior history of heart disease. Some newspapers speculated about the shock of public disgrace overwhelming a woman who had spent decades building a reputation now destroyed in moments. Others suggested the timing was too convenient, though autopsy results showed no evidence of anything but natural causes. Whether guilt killed her or merely coincidence, the result was the same. She escaped the courtroom where her daughter could not escape the attic. Death provided the exit that 25 years of imprisonment had denied to Blanche. The public reaction to Madame Monier's death was complex. Relief that she would face divine judgment, if not earthly judgment. Frustration that she had avoided public condemnation. And for some, a disturbing sense that this was the final act of control from a woman who had spent her life ensuring things happened according to her terms. But Marcel remained, and the legal system would have to decide what to do. With a man whose crime was watching, the trial began in October of 1901. The courtroom filled beyond capacity, with crowds spilling into hallways and streets outside. This was not merely a criminal proceeding, and this was France confronting questions about family authority, individual rights, and the limits of law in governing what happened inside private homes. The prosecution's case seemed straightforward. Marcel Monnier had lived in a house where his sister was imprisoned for 25 years. He had knowledge of her confinement. He had done nothing to free her or alert authorities. This constituted complicity in unlawful imprisonment, a crime under French law. But the defense had prepared a different argument entirely. Marcel's lawyer, a man named Gaston Monnier, with a reputation for technical precision, did not dispute the facts. Yes, Marcel had lived in the house. Yes, he had known about Blanche's confinement. Yes, he had taken no action to end it. Instead, Monnier argued that knowledge and inaction did not constitute a crime under existing French law. There was no statute requiring citizens to rescue others from danger, even family members. There was no legal obligation to report wrongdoing occurring within one's own household. Marcel had committed no active crime. He had simply failed to prevent one. And failure to prevent, Monnier argued, was not the same as commission. The prosecution struggled against this logic. They called witnesses who described the sounds heard from the third floor. They presented medical testimony about Blanche's condition. They documented the timeline of Marcel's residence in the house, proving beyond doubt that he had been present throughout his sister's captivity. But presence is not action. Knowledge is not participation. And French law in 1901 contained no provision criminalizing the passive witnessing of ongoing abuse. The judge, a man named Philippe Renard, with 30 years on the bench, listened to both sides with an expression that suggested he understood the moral dimensions of the case, even as he was bound by its legal limitations. During deliberations, he posed questions that revealed the gap between what society expected and what law permitted. Did Monsieur Monnier have a moral obligation to act? Renard asked the prosecution. Unquestionably, Your Honor. And does French law currently recognize such moral obligations as legally enforceable? Silence, because the answer was no. Legal scholars would later analyze this case as a turning point in discussions about duty to rescue laws, and many countries would eventually adopt legislation requiring intervention in certain circumstances, creating legal obligations from moral ones. But in 1901, these laws did not exist. Marcel sat through the trial with the same composure his mother had displayed throughout her public life. He showed no emotion during testimony about his sister's suffering. No reaction when witnesses described the conditions of her imprisonment. He was performing the same selective attention that had sustained him for 25 years, simply in a more public venue. The verdict came on November 8th. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Spectators shouted in disbelief and rage. The judge called for order repeatedly, his voice barely audible over the commotion. Outside, the crowds who had gathered to hear the verdict began expressing their fury in ways that required police intervention. But the verdict stood. Marcel Monnier was acquitted because French law had no provision under which to convict him. He had broken no statute. violated no code. The crime he committed existed in the realm of moral philosophy rather than legal precedent. Judge Renard issued a statement after the verdict, a rare step suggesting his own discomfort with the outcome. He acknowledged that the acquittal reflected the limitations of existing law rather than approval of Marcel's conduct. He called on the legislature to consider reforms that would criminalize passive complicity in ongoing abuse. But calls for reform do not undo verdicts. Marcel Monnier walked out of that courtroom a free man, a legally innocent, even as public opinion had already convicted him of moral bankruptcy. The newspapers condemned the verdict, even as they reported it. Editorial writers argued that law divorced from morality was merely bureaucracy, that a system incapable of punishing such obvious wrongdoing had failed its most basic purpose. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, demanding changes to laws that could allow such an outcome. Yet Marcel remained untouched by any of it. He returned to his home, though he would eventually sell the property and move elsewhere, unable to escape the association even as he had escaped legal consequence. He continued his law practice, though clients became scarce as his reputation preceded him into every professional interaction. He lived until 1924, dying at age 67 in relative obscurity. No public mourning marked his passing. No eulogies celebrated his life. He simply ceased to exist, having existed for decades as proof that society's moral judgments carry no weight without legal mechanisms to enforce them. The acquittal revealed something perhaps more disturbing than the imprisonment itself. It showed that justice is not inherent, but constructed, not universal, but contingent on what lawmakers remember to prohibit. Evil can operate freely in the spaces where law forgets to look. And in 1901, France, the law had forgotten to look at the crime of doing nothing while someone suffered within reach of help. Freedom arrived 25 years late, and by then the woman who had needed it no longer existed to receive it. The psychiatric hospital in Blois became Blanche Monnier's final residence. Clean sheets replaced rotted straw. Medical care replaced neglect. Kindness replaced cruelty. Everything improved, except the one thing that mattered most: her ability to recognize that anything had improved at all. The doctors who treated her documented her condition with clinical precision. She could not speak coherently, could not recognize familiar objects or understand their purpose, could not process questions or respond to simple requests. Her eyes tracked movement, but seemed to register nothing, as if vision had become merely mechanical rather than meaningful. Neurologists examined her extensively, trying to determine whether her condition resulted from physical damage or psychological trauma. The brain, they understood, but required stimulation to maintain function. 25 years of sensory deprivation had essentially starved her mind, the way minimal food had starved her body. Neurons that went unused for decades had likely pruned themselves. Neural pathways dissolving from sheer absence of activation. But was this damage reversible? Could the brain rebuild what isolation had destroyed? The medical consensus was uncertain. Some physicians believed that with time and treatment, Blanche might recover some cognitive function. Others argued that the damage was permanent, that there are windows in human development beyond which certain capacities simply cannot be restored. Both groups proved partially correct. Over months and then years, Blanche's physical health improved remarkably. She gained weight. Her skin healed. Her body remembered how to move through space in ways that suggested some recovery was possible. But her mind remained elsewhere, in that attic where 25 years had taught her that nothing changed, nothing mattered, nothing would ever be different. The prison of four walls had been replaced by the prison of a consciousness that could no longer conceive of freedom as something real. Staff at the hospital treated her with gentleness that suggested they understood who she had been before the attic. They read to her, though she showed no sign of comprehension. They played music, though she seemed not to hear it. They spoke to her as if conversation was still possible, maintaining the fiction of interaction even when responses never came. Photographs from this period show a woman who looked younger than her years in some ways, older in others. The physical ravages of starvation had healed, but her expression carried the particular emptiness of someone who had forgotten how to inhabit their own face. She appeared to be looking at things without seeing them, existing in space without occupying it. Occasionally, staff reported moments that might have been connection, a smile that seemed responsive rather than random, a sound that approximated language. But these moments were rare enough that they might have been projection, the staff wanting to see progress where only reflex existed. She had visitors in the early years, distant relatives who came from obligation rather than affection, a few journalists hoping for interviews that were impossible. The lawyer she had loved, if he indeed visited, left no record of his presence. But visits became infrequent as time passed. People moved on to new scandals, new causes, new concerns. Blanche became a historical footnote, the woman whose case had sparked outrage and legal debate, but who herself had faded into the background of her own story. The years accumulated. 1902 became 1905. 1905 became 1910. Blanche aged in the hospital the way she had aged in the attic, time passing without meaning, days identical in their gentle emptiness. On October 13, 1913, at the age of 64, Blanche Monnier died. The cause was listed as general deterioration, the medical term for a body that simply stopped trying. No specific disease, no acute illness. Just the slow shutdown of systems that had endured beyond what should have been possible. She was buried in a cemetery in Blois. A simple marker identified her name and dates. No epitaph captured what she had survived or what had been stolen from her. Just stone, recording the basic facts of existence without acknowledging the horror that had occupied the space between birth and death. Her story should have ended there. But stories like Blanche's never truly end because they force questions that each generation must answer for itself. What do we owe to people who suffer in silence? What responsibility do we bear when we sense something wrong but choose not to investigate? How many people right now are enduring their own versions of that attic, hidden behind walls we walk past daily? These questions persist because the conditions that enabled Blanche's imprisonment persist. Family privacy still shields abuse. Social convention still discourages uncomfortable questions. The cost of intervention still exceeds what many people are willing to pay. Blanche Monnier spent 25 years imprisoned by her family and 12 years imprisoned by the damage that confinement had inflicted on her mind. 37 years total where she existed, but could not truly live. Freedom came too late to save her. Justice came too weakly to matter. What remains is the story itself, the documentation of how cruelty can hide in plain sight, how evil can wear the face of respectability, how silence can be as deadly as violence, and the reminder that the only thing preventing future Blanche Monniers is people who choose to look, to question, to act, when everything in their comfortable lives encourages them to simply look away. The Monnier house still stands on Rue de la Visitation. Different families have owned it over the decades. Some stayed only briefly, claiming the place carried an oppressive atmosphere that made peaceful habitation impossible. Others remained for years without reporting anything unusual. Whether the house is haunted or simply holds the weight of historical knowledge is a question best left to individual belief. What matters is that the story persists, carried forward by people who refuse to let Blanche's suffering be forgotten. Stories like this exist at the edge of what we want history to be. They are uncomfortable, disturbing. They remind us that monsters are often respected members of society, that victims are often invisible until it is too late, and that the difference between helping and ignoring can be measured in human lives. But these are exactly the stories that demand telling. These are the voices that history tries to bury, because acknowledging them requires acknowledging how much suffering we have collectively permitted through our silence. If Blanche's story matters to you, if you believe these forgotten voices deserve to be heard and remembered, if you think understanding past horrors might help us prevent future ones, then hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel. Because every like, every subscription, every share tells me that this work matters. These stories take weeks of research, hours in archives, careful verification of facts, and I do it because I believe the people who suffered in silence deserve to have their stories told with accuracy and respect. And if you want to support this channel, so I can keep bringing you these forgotten histories, there is a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. Your support means I can spend more time in libraries and less time worried about whether I can afford to keep doing this work. And to everyone who has already contributed, thank you. You are literally preserving history. Now go. Remember Blanche Monnier. Remember that silence enables horror. And refuse to look away when something feels wrong. Because the next person suffering in silence might be saved by someone who chose to ask questions instead of accepting comfortable lies.